The thought of Christmas morning usually evokes thoughts of freshly fallen snow, Christmas presents, and a general feeling of joy. However, for the Sotter family of Fayetteville, West Virginia, Christmas morning of 1945 instead brought dread and despair as their family home burned to ashes. 5 of the Sotter family's children were still inside the home at the time. However, their remains were never found, leading to speculation that the children had been abducted and that the fire had been intentionally set. Hey everyone, my name is Lauren Elizabeth. On this channel, I talk about true crime, missing people, and unsolved cases. I don't mean any disrespect, but I believe it's important to talk about in order to keep these stories alive and work toward finding justice for victims wherever possible. If you like true crime content, please subscribe to this channel. Today, we're talking about the disappearance of the Sotter children in 1945. George and Jennie Sodder were both Italian immigrants to America. Jennie's family had immigrated to America when she was only an infant, while George hadn't arrived until he was around 13 years old. He had immigrated to America with an older brother. However, not long after their arrival, this older brother would return to Italy, leaving a young George alone to fend for himself. George managed to make it just fine on his own, though. He found work on the railroads and later as a driver, and would eventually open his own trucking company. In his 20s, George met and fell in love with Jennie Cipriani, who he would later marry. The two settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and began building their family. George and Jennie would end up having a total of 10 children: John, Joseph, Marianne, George Jr., Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, and Sylvia. The large family lived in a 2-story home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, in an area where a lot of other Italian immigrants also lived. George's trucking company was doing quite well, and the family was considered to be well off. World War II had just ended a few months earlier, leaving everyone in high spirits. Joseph Sotter, the second oldest Sotter child, was stationed overseas, and his family was excitedly awaiting his return home. On Christmas Eve of 1945, a 19-year-old Marianne Sotter brought home toys from the store where she worked to give to her younger sisters Martha, Betty, and Jennie. The girls were so excited to have received some Christmas presents a night early, so excited in fact that they convinced their parents to allow them to stay up later to play with their new toys. Jennie agreed to let the girls stay up later, saying that they could stay up as long as their older siblings were also still awake. Jennie and George then went upstairs to bed, along with John, George Jr., and little Sylvia, while all the other children remained downstairs. At 12:30 a.m., Jennie was woken up to her telephone ringing. She went downstairs to answer the call, and an unfamiliar voice on the other end of the phone asked for a name that Jennie did not recognize. Jennie told the woman that she had the wrong number, and then this woman began laughing. Jennie said she also heard other sounds of laughter and clinking dishes in the background of this call. Jennie thought this call was odd, but didn't think anything of it at the time. At this point, Jennie also noticed that the curtains were still open and the lights were still on downstairs. She thought this was odd. Usually whenever the kids stayed up later than her and George, they would remember to turn off the lights and close the curtains. Jennie saw Marianne asleep on the couch and assumed that all the other children had gone to bed. She turned off the light, shut the curtains, and went back to bed. About half an hour later, at 1:30 a.m., Jennie Sodder was woken up again, this time to the sound of a loud thud on the roof. Jennie said it sounded like something had hit the roof and then rolled off the side of it. Another 20 minutes or so would go by, and Jennie would be woken again, this time to the smell of smoke, which seemed to be coming from a large fire inside of George's office. Panicked, Jennie woke her husband and then ran through the house trying to wake her children as the house was becoming engulfed in flames. Jennie, George, John, Marianne, George Jr., and little Sylvia all made it out of the burning house safely, but that left 5 children still inside, likely trapped in their attic bedroom. Marianne ran next door to try and call the fire department, while George went to grab a ladder that the family kept at the side of the house. However, inexplicably, this ladder was nowhere to be found. George then ran to one of his coal trucks that he had on the property. He was hoping to be able to back the truck up against the wall and climb up to the attic that way. However, the truck that had been working fine the day prior was dead. George ran to another truck he had on the property, which was also inexplicably dead. George tried to scoop water out of a barrel they had by the side of the house, but it was frozen solid in the December cold. Desperately, George Sotter tried to find a way to enter the burning house. With no other options, he even tried scaling the wall of the house, but to no avail. Their house was engulfed in flames, with no way for them to get to their children who were still inside. Meanwhile, Marianne had run to a next-door neighbor to try to call the fire department. However, she was unable to get through to an operator. A neighbor nearby had seen the blaze and also attempted to call the fire department, once again having issues getting through to an operator. In addition to apparently being very hard to contact, the fire department was also severely understaffed. Fire Chief J.F. Maurice, who was the only one at the station that night, didn't even know how to drive the fire truck. Ultimately, the fire department didn't arrive at the Sotter family home until 8 a.m. on Christmas morning, a whole 7 hours after the blaze had begun. After the fire was finally put out, the fire marshal searched the charred remains of the home. The fire was deemed to have been started by faulty wiring, and strangely, no remains of any of the 5 Sotter children were found. Even though their remains were never found, the 5 missing Sotter children were all declared as dead within the following weeks. George and Jennie bulldozed dirt onto what remained of their home and made it into a memorial for their 5 missing children. Despite what local authorities said, Jennie and George Sotter never believed that their children died in that fire. Their remains were never found, and a fire that was allegedly caused by faulty wiring could have never burned hot enough to fully incinerate human remains. The tall ladder that the Sotter family usually kept at the side of their house that wasn't there when they needed it was later found ditched a ways down the road. Additionally, it was found that telephone wires in the Sotter home had been cut and not just burned. The Sotter family also had a fairly decent reason to believe that they may have been targeted. George Sotter was well known in the community, and while he was largely liked, he was also very outspoken about his dislike for the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, which may have made him a target for the very pro-Mussolini Italian mafia. There had also reportedly been threats made toward George Sotter in the months before the fire. In the fall of that year, a door-to-door salesman had come to the Sotter home, trying to sell George an insurance policy. When George declined this offer, this man allegedly became irate, yelling and telling George, quote, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." There was another strange encounter in and around the same time, when a man approached the house looking for work. While chatting with George, this man made a comment about the fuse box on the house, saying that it was going to cause a fire one day. George says he remembers thinking this comment was odd because he had just had the fuse box inspected a few weeks previous and everything was said to be fine. There were a lot of sketchy details about the case. The strange phone call that Jennie had received, or the sound that she heard on the roof in the early hours of the morning, the fact that the ladder was missing from the side of the home, and the fact that both of their coal trucks were suddenly no longer working, the strange encounter that George had had just a few months prior, and most strange of all, the fact that no remains were found of any of the 5 children. But in the face of all the sketchy details, the authorities deemed that the children had perished in the fire and they did not plan on investigating any further. With no help from the local police, Jennie and George began their own efforts to try and find out what had happened to their children. They put up posters and handed out flyers, and a few years after the fire, they put up a large billboard along Route 16 in Fayetteville, asking for a $5,000 reward for any information leading to the whereabouts of their children. In later years, this reward would be raised to $10,000. There were alleged sightings of the Sotter children. One woman claimed she saw them in the back of a car driving away on that Christmas morning. Another woman, who ran a tourist stop about 80 kilometers away from the Sotter family home, also claimed that she saw the children on Christmas Day with a man and a woman traveling in a car with Florida license plates. Yet another woman came forward a few weeks after the disappearance, saying that she had seen the children in and around Christmas in a Charleston hotel. The woman said she saw the 5 children at this hotel with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom were Italian. She said she had tried to chat with the children, but the 2 men became hostile before shooing her away and began yelling at each other in Italian. Sadly, none of these sightings ever amounted to anything, and after 2 years of nothing and no help from the police, Jennie and George Sotter reached out to the FBI, asking them if they could investigate. In response, the FBI said that the case did not technically fall under their jurisdiction. However, they would be willing to look into the case as long as they got permission from the local authorities. However, this permission was denied, and the FBI was unable to look into the case. With the FBI unable to investigate, Jennie and George then hired their own private investigator to find out what had happened to their children. They hired a man named C.C. Tinsley, and it was at this point that even more sketchy details about the case would come to light. It was discovered that one of the men on the jury to determine the cause of the fire at the Sotter family home had been the same man who had threatened George Sotter just months earlier, a conflict of interest to say the very least. It was also uncovered by this private investigator that Fire Chief J.F. Maurice had confessed to a priest that remains had in fact been found in the ashes of the Sotter family home. Apparently Maurice had found remains at the scene of the fire and for some reason decided not to tell anybody or the Sodder family. He instead put the remains in a box and secretly buried them in the forest. Strange, to say the least. When this discovery was made, Jennie and George confronted the fire chief about it. He had admitted to it and said that a heart had been found among the ashes. This heart was recovered and tested, and in yet another strange turn of events, it turned out to be a pig's heart. And not only that, but this pig's heart showed that it had no signs of charring, meaning that it had never been in a fire. So it was not in the Sodder family home when it had burned down. After this, the site of the Sodder family home was excavated, and this time a small amount of tiny pieces of bone were found. The bone pieces were sent to be tested, and the results indicated that the bones had not come from any of the 5 Sodder children. The bones were found to have come from somebody at least 17 years old. The report said that it was possible, although highly unlikely, that the bones could have come from someone younger than 17 years old, and the oldest of the 5 missing Sodder children was only 14 years old at the time. Also, just like the pig's heart that had been allegedly found among the ashes, these bones showed no sign of charring and showed no sign that they had ever been in a fire. The report also noted that if the bone fragments had come from any of the 5 Sodder children, they would expect to find 5 full skeletons instead of only a few small pieces of bone. It's widely believed that these bones had already been in the soil of the Sodder family home long before the fire ever took place. However, it's not known where or who these bones came from. Another strange item found at the site of the fire was a small, hard, melted bit of what looked like rubber. George Sotter was convinced that this was the remains of a pineapple grenade or some other kind of incendiary device. George Sotter believes this is what Jennie heard the morning of the fire when she heard something falling onto the roof. After these bones were found, there were 2 hearings about the Sodder children and the investigation into their disappearance. However, these hearings ended with Jennie and George being told that their search was hopeless and the case was deemed to be closed. Despite this, Jennie and George never stopped searching for their children and never stopped believing that they were out there. Jennie and George believed that there was some kind of cover-up going on, but they couldn't understand why. They continued to try to keep their children's story in the public eye as much as possible, but without support from local authorities, it was difficult. The billboard on Route 16 remained standing, and the Sodders raised the reward to $10,000 for any information leading to the whereabouts of the Sodder children. Over the years, the Sodders hired multiple private investigators, and they continued to receive reports of sightings. As I mentioned before, there were people who claimed to have seen the Sodder children after their disappearance, a woman claiming to have seen them in the back of the car, another woman seeing them at a tourist stop, and another at a Charleston hotel. In later years, there'd be another woman who swore that she saw Martha Sodder working as a nun in a convent. A bartender from Texas claimed that he'd once overheard a man drunkenly bragging about how he had burned a house down and kidnapped a bunch of children. There was also a bus driver who had claimed that he had been driving through Fayetteville that morning and he had seen what looked like someone launching fireballs at a house as he drove by. Even George Sotter himself was convinced that he had seen his children. He had seen a photo of Manhattan school children in a newspaper, and he was convinced that one of them was his daughter Betty. George Sotter even drove to Manhattan to try to find this girl. However, the girl's family insisted that she was not Betty and did not allow George to see her. Years after the disappearance, a woman in Houston, Texas wrote to George and Jennie Sodder to tell them that a man she knew had drunkenly confessed to her that he was Louis Sodder. This man apparently told her that he was Louis Sodder and that he was living in the area with his older brother Maurice. George traveled to Houston, Texas and found this man. However, this man denied being Louis Sodder and denied ever telling anybody that he was. Apparently, George didn't fully believe this man and suspected that he could in fact be his son. However, the man thoroughly denied that he was Louis Sodder, and it was never proven otherwise. In 1968, 23 years after the fire, a letter arrived at the doorstep addressed to Jennie Sodder. There was no return address, but the letter was postmarked in Kentucky. Inside the envelope was a photo of a young man, and on the back of the photo was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Lil boys. A90132 or 35. The man in the photo did admittedly bear a striking resemblance to Louis Sodder, who was 10 years old at the time of his disappearance. However, they were never able to find the true origin of this photo, and the caption didn't seem to make sense. There was no Sodder child named Frankie, and the rest of the caption didn't seem to make much sense either. Many believe that this photo was just a hoax, a cruel prank played on the Sotter family. However, Jennie and George truly believe that this photo is of their son Louis. They had this photo enlarged and they hung a framed copy above their fireplace. Additionally, they updated the billboard on Route 16 to include this new photo of who they believed to be Louis Sotter. George Sotter passed away the following year in 1969 at the age of 79. George always believed that his children were out there, however he passed away without ever knowing what had happened to them. Over the years, there would be more alleged sightings of the Sotter children, however, none of these sightings ever amounted to anything. Jennie Sodder passed away in 1989 at the age of 85. Like her husband 20 years earlier, Jennie passed away without ever knowing what had happened to her children. It was said that Jennie only wore black clothing after the fire and continued to wear only black clothing until the day she died. Today, it's been 75 years since the fire and since the disappearance of the Sotter children. Nobody has ever found out what happened to them, and at this point, it looks like we never will. Sylvia Sotter, the youngest Sotter child, is the only family member still alive today, now aged 77. Like her parents did, Sylvia firmly believes that her older siblings did not die in that fire. As for theories about what exactly happened to the Sotter children, there are different ideas about the specifics, but most people seem to agree that they likely did not die in that fire. The most common theory, the one that's most widely believed, and the one that seems to be the most substantial, is that the family was targeted by the Italian mafia. However, this still leaves plenty of questions and sketchy facts. A lot of people think that it's strange that if the mafia were to target the family, that there was never any request for ransom made for any of the 5 children. This case is all around confusing and sketchy, and ultimately, nobody truly knows what really happened to the Sotter children that Christmas morning. Please let me know what you think about this strange case and what you think may have happened to the Sotter children. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope everyone out there has a safe and happy holiday this year. If you'd like to see more true crime content, please subscribe to this channel. Stay safe, everybody.